Have you ever had a moment where life feels off? Like the air is too still, the rhythm of the world too perfectly in sync, or a passing stranger's gaze lingers for just a second too long? It's that fleeting sensation, a whisper of doubt that perhaps what you see, touch, and hear isn't quite what it seems. A glitch in the matrix, as some would call it? But what if that feeling isn't just the product of an overactive imagination? What if it's something more, a breadcrumb guiding you toward the ultimate question? Is this world real, or are we living in a simulation? I remember one afternoon vividly. I was sitting in a corner of my favorite cafe, surrounded by the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of soft conversations. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. It was one of those rare, picturesque moments when everything seemed just right. Too right. A scene so harmonious it almost felt curated, like it had been designed for maximum aesthetic appeal. I couldn't shake the nagging unease, a faint sense that I was a character in someone else's story. It was then that my phone buzzed, drawing my attention to an article. The headline read, "Are we living in a simulation?" The piece was about Nick Bostrom's famous hypothesis. The theory suggests that if a civilization becomes advanced enough, it might create highly sophisticated simulations of its own ancestors, essentially virtual realities indistinguishable from true existence. As I read, I couldn't help but feel a chill. It seemed absurd on the surface, like science fiction taken too seriously. But the logic was disturbingly plausible. Think about it. Everything we experience, our senses, our memories, our emotions, comes from signals interpreted by the brain. If a program could replicate those signals, mimicking the texture of wood beneath your fingertips or the sharp bite of winter air on your face, how would we ever know the difference? The table before me, the sound of the barista's laughter, the bitterness of the espresso on my tongue. What if all of it was just an elaborate illusion crafted by some incomprehensibly advanced software? My mind wandered further. I scanned the room, watching the people around me. A man in a suit typed furiously on his laptop, his movements almost mechanical. A woman adjusted her scarf, the gesture fluid and natural, but was it? For the first time I wondered, were they real? Was I? As the thoughts spiraled, it took on a deeply personal dimension. If the world was just a simulation, then what did that make me? Was I merely an avatar, a programmed entity following a predetermined script? Or was there something within me, something intangible, uncodable, that existed beyond the simulation? The questions clawed at my sense of self, unraveling the foundation of everything I thought I knew. My gaze settled on the cup of coffee in my hand. I studied its shape, the way the ceramic reflected the light, the faint steam rising from the liquid. I tapped it gently with my fingernail, listening to the faint clink. Real enough. But then, if the simulation was flawless, wouldn't it feel this real? The thought was maddening. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was existential terror. If my reality could be a lie, then what could I trust? Who or what was I truly? But as the panic began to take hold, another thought emerged, quieter but more profound. If this was a simulation, then what was its purpose? Who had designed it, and why? Was it a test, an experiment, or something entirely beyond human comprehension? My mind flickered back to a conversation I'd had with a friend years ago. He was a devout meditator, deeply immersed in spiritual philosophy. Once during a discussion about reality, he'd said, "What if life is like a dream? When you're dreaming, everything feels real, the people, the places, the emotions. But when you wake up, you realize it was all an illusion. What if this life is just another dream, and enlightenment is simply waking up. At the time, I brushed it off as poetic mysticism. But now his words resonated with a new and haunting clarity. As I sat in that cafe, the weight of the idea settled over me. If this was all a simulation, it wasn't just a question of science or technology, it was a question of meaning, a question of self. And in that moment, for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, I felt both terrified and oddly liberated. What if the very illusion of reality was the point? What if, hidden within the simulation, there was something more, something real, waiting to be discovered? I leaned back in my chair, staring out of the window at the bustling street beyond. Cars zipped by, their headlights glinting in the late afternoon sun. Pedestrians hurried along, caught up in their own worlds, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, by the question that had seized me. For them, life was simple: work, family, dreams, and routines. But for me, in that moment, it was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing an unsettling yet strangely beautiful truth: the possibility that everything I knew was an illusion. And yet, wasn't there also comfort in the idea? If life was a simulation, then perhaps its imperfections weren't flaws but deliberate designs, challenges meant to teach and shape us. The thought lingered as I finished my coffee, its bitter taste grounding me in the moment. For now, the answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear: the question itself had irrevocably changed the way I saw the world and myself. The article I'd read had laid out several hypotheses. One theory suggested that advanced civilizations might create simulations to study their ancestors. It made a certain kind of sense. After all, don't we run simulations of our own? Scientists recreate ancient ecosystems, project climate models, and even simulate human behavior to predict economic trends. If we, with our relatively rudimentary technology, already do this, wouldn't a far more advanced civilization do the same on an unimaginable scale? But another theory sent chills down my spine: the idea that this simulation might not be a study but a prison, a system designed not to enlighten or observe, but to confine. What if the purpose was to keep us unaware of some greater truth, something we were never meant to discover? My thoughts drifted to religion and philosophy, realms that have wrestled with the nature of reality for centuries. The parallels were striking. The concept of grand illusion suggests that the physical world is not the ultimate truth. Instead, it's a veil, a mirage, that obscures the unchanging reality of the divine. Similarly, Plato's allegory of the cave described a world where humans, shackled and forced to watch shadows on a wall, mistake the illusions for reality. Even in Christianity, there are whispers of this idea that the material world is fleeting and that true existence lies beyond. I began to wonder, were these ancient teachings early attempts to articulate what we now call simulation theory? After all, the language of divinity and philosophy was the only framework they had to describe something so abstract, so beyond their understanding. Perhaps the idea that life is an illusion isn't new. It's just that now we've given it a technological context. The tension within me grew as I grappled with the implications. If reality is a simulation, then who or what created it? Was it a benevolent creator, akin to the gods of mythology, designing a world for us to experience and learn from? Or was it something colder, more mechanical, a post-human civilization conducting experiments without regard for the beings inside them? But the most unsettling question wasn't about the creator, it was about myself. If the world is a simulation, then is my consciousness also simulated? Or is it something real, something separate from the program? This idea, this possibility that consciousness might be the only thing that's truly real, began to take root in my mind. As I walked through the streets, watching people go about their lives, I tried to imagine what it would mean if they weren't real in the way I thought they were. Was the elderly man feeding pigeons in the park merely a string of code? Were the children laughing on the swings nothing more than well-crafted simulations? And if that were true, then what was my role in all of this? Was I a player, like in a video game, navigating a pre-designed world? Or was I just another character, unaware of the larger script? My internal struggle deepened as I reflected on my own experiences. The memories of love, loss, joy, and pain, were they authentic? Or were they programmed responses calculated to mimic the complexity of real emotion? And if they were fake, did that make them any less meaningful? The thought was dizzying, and for a moment I felt utterly untethered, as though the ground beneath my feet had dissolved. But then a curious thing happened. Amid my spiraling doubts, I remembered the teachings of my friend, the one who meditated daily and spoke of awakening. He had once told me, even if the world is an illusion, it doesn't mean it's meaningless. In fact, it might mean the opposite. If reality is a dream, then your actions within it take on a new kind of significance. They're not just about survival, they're about discovery. His words resonated now in a way they hadn't before. If this was a simulation, then maybe it wasn't meant to deceive, but to reveal. Maybe the glitches, the moments where the illusion faltered, were clues, breadcrumbs leading us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and our purpose. Perhaps the simulation wasn't a prison, but a mirror reflecting the infinite possibilities of consciousness itself. This thought brought with it a strange kind of comfort. It reframed my unease not as a sign of something wrong, but as an invitation to explore. If reality was indeed an illusion, then what lay beyond it? And if the world was a simulation, then what was it trying to teach me? As I reached my apartment, the sunset bathed the city in hues of gold and crimson. For a moment, I stood still, watching the sky transform. The beauty of it was undeniable, whether it was real or not. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The question of reality's authenticity mattered less than I thought. What mattered more was how I chose to engage with it. Whether it was a simulation or not, this world, the one before me right now, was my reality. And that meant it was worth exploring, questioning, and living full. My unease hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. The fear of the unknown was still there, but it was joined by something else, a sense of wonder. The question remained unanswered, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the journey, the search for meaning, truth, and connection was the real purpose all along. At this point, I had spent days, weeks really, wrestling with the concept of the simulation. It was an intellectual puzzle that felt more like a personal journey. The more I dug into it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about technology or philosophy, it was about consciousness. What is consciousness, really? Is it something that exists independently of the world, or is it simply a product of the simulation we're living in? Let's imagine for a moment that we are, in fact, living in a simulation. This opens up a profound question. Does our consciousness, the very thing that allows us to think, feel, and experience the world, also exist outside the simulation, or is it part of it? If our thoughts and emotions are simply responses to stimuli, just like a character in a video game reacts to its programming, then where does the real us reside? Is there an essence of consciousness that transcends the simulation, or is our perception of self just another line of code? As I pondered this, a thought struck me. What if the simulation itself is a tool for evolution, a cosmic playground designed not to control us but to help consciousness evolve? Perhaps it's not about trapping us in an endless cycle, but about nudging us toward enlightenment. If you think about it, a game has rules and challenges. You must solve puzzles, face obstacles, and grow to reach the next level. The game may seem like a distraction, but in reality, it's shaping you, teaching you, expanding your capacity for understanding. This is where the teachings of Eastern philosophy began to collide with simulation theory. There's a parable in Buddhist teachings about enlightenment. A person is trapped in a dream, suffering, feeling desperate to escape. But when they finally realize they are dreaming, the suffering vanishes. Not because the dream changes, but because their understanding of it changes. What if the simulation is just like that? What if our journey is about waking up inside the dream? What if our purpose is not to escape the simulation, but to transcend it? I began to see the potential beauty in this. The very notion of a simulation could be a tool for consciousness to grow, not by rejecting reality, but by understanding it for what it is. If life is a game, then perhaps the key to enlightenment is not in avoiding the game, but in mastering it. This idea wasn't so foreign. In fact, it mirrored concepts I had encountered in many different spiritual traditions, where the path to truth isn't about fleeing the illusion, but about seeing through it and using it to deepen our understanding of the self. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a sense of urgency. If we truly are in a simulation, then it changes everything. It means the stakes are higher than we think. It's not just about survival or passing through life in a passive state. It's about actively engaging with the experience, questioning the rules, seeking out the hidden layers, and ultimately waking up. But waking up to what? To the realization that we are not just characters in a game, but players, participants in a far grander experiment than we can even fathom. This, of course, led to more questions. If the simulation is a tool for growth, who or what is behind it? Is it some advanced civilization that views us as children, guiding us toward enlightenment? Or is it a natural byproduct of consciousness itself, a self-created environment in which we play, learn, and evolve? It's hard to say, but one thing became clear: the simulation, if it exists, is not a trap. It's a mirror reflecting back our deepest questions, our fears, and our potential for growth. At the heart of this, there's another layer to explore: our own personal development. If we take this theory seriously, then we have to confront our own purpose within the simulation. Are we merely passive observers, or are we active participants, shaping our reality with every choice we make? The more I examined my life, the more I realized how much of my existence was driven by an unconscious script, a set of expectations, fears, and desires that I had never questioned. If I were in a simulation, then perhaps the task was not to live according to these preset patterns, but to break free of them, to become aware of the illusion and start creating my own story. In that sense, the simulation theory becomes less about proving the existence of a digital world and more about examining the nature of existence itself. What does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to be alive? If we are living in a simulation, perhaps the greatest discovery is that we are not defined by the simulation at all. We are defined by our capacity to question, to evolve, and to grow beyond it. This was where the plot thickened, where my understanding of the world and of myself began to shift. It wasn't just about contemplating the nature of reality, it was about how I lived within that reality. The challenge wasn't in accepting the simulation, but in engaging with it in a way that allowed for growth, for depth, and for meaningful change. I could see now that if this world was indeed a simulation, then it didn't diminish my existence. If anything, it elevated it. The purpose wasn't to escape, it was to wake up, to become conscious of the illusion, and to use that awareness to craft a richer, more intentional life. As I sat with this realization, the urgency I once felt began to dissolve. It wasn't about rushing to find the answer, it was about embracing the questions. The beauty of the simulation, if it were one, was that it didn't have to be real to be meaningful. In fact, its very impermanence was what gave it value. If it was all a simulation, then I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. As I sat back and took in the enormity of what I had been considering, one thing became painfully clear. The real question isn't whether the world is a simulation or not. It's about how we engage with the world. Whether it's real or fake, illusion or truth, we are still here, still experiencing it. And in that experience, we have the power to create meaning. That perhaps is where the true beauty lies. It's easy to become consumed by the idea that if this world is a simulation, then nothing matters. If our entire existence is just a program running on some advanced computer, then what's the point? Why bother with love or pain or effort if it's all just a fabricated reality? But here's the thing, the very fact that we are asking these questions, pondering the nature of existence, the meaning of life, means that we are something beyond the simulation. We are consciousness itself, questioning, searching, evolving. That, to me, is the most profound truth of all. In that sense, the simulation theory doesn't diminish us, it actually elevates us. If we are in a simulated reality, then we are participants in a grand experiment. The stakes may not be what we thought, but that doesn't make our choices any less meaningful. If anything, it adds a layer of responsibility. If life is an illusion, then the love we give, the kindness we show, and the wisdom we seek are all acts of defiance against the program, acts of free will that transcend the limitations of the simulation itself. Imagine it this way. In a video game, the character doesn't know it's a character. It doesn't know it's part of a larger game. But we, if we are conscious of the simulation, can be different. We can choose to break free from the constraints of the game's programming. We can choose to rise above the patterns that have been laid out for us, to make decisions not based on fear or habit, but on a conscious, intentional awareness. It's not about escaping the simulation, it's about waking up within it and recognizing that we have the power to shape the narrative, even if that narrative is a constructed reality. This brings us to the final question. If this world is a simulation, does it mean nothing matters? Or does it mean everything matters even more? Perhaps if this is a simulation, it doesn't invalidate the importance of our choices. Instead, it might make them even more significant. The stakes may not be physical, but they are emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Every act of kindness, every moment of connection, every spark of creativity isn't just part of the program, it might be the point of the program. The purpose of the simulation could very well be to help us evolve into beings who understand that reality is both real and unreal, and that the only truth that truly matters is the one we create for ourselves in the process. As I stand here now, I realize that the search for meaning is not a futile pursuit. It's the most important thing we can do. Whether we are players in a game, characters in a program, or conscious beings navigating a digital world, what matters most is how we choose to live, how we choose to love, how we choose to evolve. And so I invite you to reflect on this. The next time you encounter a glitch in the matrix, don't be afraid to embrace it. Instead of dismissing it as an error, take a moment to ask, is this real? And if it isn't, does it even matter? Because perhaps the beauty of life, whether it's real or simulated, is in the act of living it. In playing the game, not to win, but to learn, to grow, and to evolve. The question of whether we live in a simulation may remain unanswered, but the answer we find within ourselves, the way we live, the way we engage with this reality, is the answer that truly matters. What do you think? Are we living in a simulation, or is this just another way for humans to explain the unexplainable? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of existence.